I said, we're celebrating in 2 weeks a wedding, but I can just look back, and 23 years ago, she was in diapers. Where did those 23 years go? When you think about for any of us within our life, think about how your families have grown and they move on and life changes. And now if you're in the midst of having little kids and little children in diapers, and it's like, man, when will this ever end? But it goes in the blink of an eye. We need to see life, I believe, biblically we're called to see life from God's perspective, not my perspective. But what does God want out of me within my life? But we're also called to see the fact that life is short. That we're given 86,400 seconds a day, and it's up to us to use those to the best of our ability. It's up to us to use those for the gifts that God's given to us. Now, Kim, would you go back to the Excel? Back a couple of slides. This, if anybody would be interested, I can email it to you. It's an Excel program somebody sent me quite a few years ago. What you do is you type in when you were born. I type in May 18, 1960. I'm estimating that I'm going to leave here maybe May 18, 2040. I'm figuring 80 years. Hopefully, I'm sort of healthy, and hopefully I'll go that far. 80 years. So I have completed 2,674 weeks, 18,000 days, that many hours, 26 million days, and a billion or whatever that is, seconds. But this is the one that sometimes I look at. It's called the donut of time. 64% of my life, if I live to be 80, is gone. I got 35% left. The first time that I did this, I got this about 10 years ago. And so then I was just 40, so I was at the 50-50 point. I thought, man, I'm doing pretty good. When I opened it up the other day and saw that, whoa, it had changed to 2/3, 1/3. Life is short. We're only given so much time. The question is, how do we use that time? You see, we can use that time for God's glory. We can use that time for serving Him, for understanding the purpose within our lives. Or we can use that time for ourselves. The psalmist in the first 6 verses here sets up a contradiction and shows that God is eternal, God is faithful, God is holy. Humanity, we're fickle, we're finite, we're unfaithful. And we're called to see life through God's perspective with limited funds within our lives. And we're called not to gamble everything away. And you see, the biggest gamble that we have in life is when we gamble our time away in sin. When we gamble our time away in sin. The psalmist says this. He says to us that we're called to avoid sin because what does sin do to us? It only makes life harder. Makes it a lot harder. We are consumed by your anger, O Lord. We are terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before us. I love that verse. You have set our iniquities before us. Some of you may remember that Psalm 51 is my favorite psalm in Scripture. David and Bathsheba. And David says about his affair with Bathsheba, he says, Lord, my iniquities are ever set before me. My sin is ever before me. What do we think? We think we can do sin. We think we can get involved with the partying, with the drinking, with the extramarital affairs. We think we can get involved with all those things, and God's not going to see it. The reality is, God does see it. And the reality is, when we sin within our life, it makes our life harder. Right now, there is at present, I just recently read, somewhere around 1 million teen pregnancies within America, with 1 in 5 of those being aborted. And we say nobody gets hurt, and I say, what about the child that was aborted? Was that child hurt? AIDS is one of the leading killers of young adults from age 25 to 44. 25% of the people, it's estimated, that are affected with AIDS are underneath the age of 22. And we say that sin doesn't hurt us. The reality is that when we walk in sin, it hurts us in the present and in the future. And the psalmist is saying, if we get that perspective from God, if we realize that life is short, we're then called to learn to avoid the sin. Oh Lord, we are consumed by your anger. We're terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before us, our secret sins in the light of your presence. Our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. The word moan there within Hebrew actually means we live a dying, whining, it sounds sort of sad. We live a dying, whining, complaining life, and we groan at its termination. I mean, it sounds sort of bleak, doesn't it? That we live a dying, whining, complaining life, and we groan at life's termination. To me, that sounds pretty doom and gloom, but if I look around, and having known many of you for many different years, and some of you just more recently, all of us have gone through struggles and issues. We've all had our complaints. We've all had our whining. We've all had those issues, be it within ourselves or within our families or within our jobs. So the question comes, do those things that we whine and complain about come from the hand of somebody else, or do they come from our own sin? That's what the psalmist is talking about here. You and I are called to, within our own lives, strive to avoid the sin which causes the whining and the complaining. Verse 10 goes on and says, the length of our days is 70 years or 80 years if we have the strength. I put my donut of time in for 80 years. Yet their span is but trouble and sorrow. They pass quickly and we fly by. Who knows the power of your anger? For your wrath is as great as the fear that is due you. Some people read this psalm and get stuck on these verses and say, wow, God's wrath sounds so bad and God sounds so mean. I don't believe so. I believe the reality is that yes, God has a wrath towards sin, and sin cannot be in God's presence. And yet God is not so mean, because God loved us so much, He sent His Son for our salvation. See, there's a huge difference between Christianity and Islam. I know I've talked about this before, just a few months ago, with a young pastor who used to be a Muslim, but who is now a Christian. But he has explained to me many times, he explained to here within church a few years ago, the fact that within Islam, they do all of their actions to appease the angry Allah. And he has said that they hope and they pray when they die they've done enough good to offset Allah's anger. That is totally opposite Christianity. Christianity says God is a loving, gracious God who sent His Son to give us life. Life eternal. What are we called to do? Called to give our lives over to Him. And in the process of giving our lives over to Him, daily strive to avoid sin, to not make life harder. So within this, we're called to avoid the sin within our lives, but we're also called then to realign our life's priorities. In some respects, the first part of the psalm here ends up with the end of the psalm. Remember, the first part of the psalm is looking at life through God's perspective, that God, you were from the beginning, before the worlds were created, you were there. God, we need to see life through your eyes, God. The psalmist ends up here and says, okay, God, now I need to realign my life priority with you. The psalmist says, teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. I think the central part of this psalm is right here in this verse. teach us to number our days,